Gaddafi and the sovereign government of Libya. Yet it's no coincidence that the invective against Libya is long on the name-calling and short on the facts. In way of introduction to our main speaker, I would like to go over a few of the facts concerning Libya. Located in northern Africa on the shores of the strategic Mediterranean Sea, Libya has a population of about 4 million people. The tabloids don't say that this nation, which Reagan has called a threat to the national security of the United States, has a population of less than 1/60th that of the U.S. and is 6,000 miles away. The networks are not explaining that the Libyan people have a long and bitter experience under imperialist masters. For example, Mussolini imperialism waged a war of annihilation against Libya and killed literally half the population of that country. Then Nazi Germany and Britain and France seized control. But while during World War II the imperialists fought among themselves on Libyan soil for control of the world, the Libyan people suffered terribly. And to this day, a major cause of injury through accident is due to farmers unknowingly plowing into live mines and bombs left from the Northern African campaign. Next, Washington was the master and ruled through King Idris, an absolute monarch and corrupt tool of the oil companies. Exxon, Texaco, Mobil, and the like siphoned off Libya's oil wealth while the people got nothing. Yet neither Washington nor the media decried that this was unjust. Wheelus Air Force Base, the largest U.S. base in the area, dominated Libya and secured U.S. hegemony in the oil-rich Middle East. One of Gaddafi's first acts upon seizing power and kicking out King Idris in 1969 was a few months later in 1970 to close the Wheelus Air Force Base and send the U.S. packing. And this is what first put him on Washington's enemy list. We are not told by the Ted Koppels and the Dan Rathers of the dramatic contrast for the Libyan people since then. While not guided by Marxism, Gaddafi has used the country's oil wealth to benefit the people. Starting with one of the poorest countries in the world, between 1969, when he took power, and 1981, the Libyan government has built 200,000 homes. The average annual wage is 5 times higher now than it was a decade ago. The number of preparatory schools has increased 9-fold. Can the Reagan administration or any state or county or city government in this country make such claims? Housing is free for a big chunk of the population, especially the poorest. Today, basic needs are met in Libya to a greater degree than any other Arab country. Privileges of the few have been curtailed. Laws were passed making it hard for foreigners to take money out of the country, limiting the amount of money people can have in banks to $3,000, and declaring it illegal to own more than one home, which means that you can't own any homes that you can't live in. Can you imagine what a law, if enforced, would mean in New York City? And what the media describes as Libyan terrorism is support for the national liberation struggles. In addition to having relations with the Soviet Union, Libya has provided political and often substantial material support via its oil money to liberation struggles from Palestine to the Philippines, from Ireland to Southern Africa. When Washington canceled all loans to Nicaragua, Libya stepped in and gave that country $100 million in aid. Gaddafi has made an appeal to Ronald Reagan to liberate native people here. These are the things that the magnates in the boardrooms of the giant oil companies and the banks want to change. They want to go back to the good old days when Exxon and Texaco ruled Libya. And this is why they have sent 28 ships, which this very moment are now off the coast of Libya. Here to talk to us on Libya under the Pentagon's gun is Sam Marcy, chairperson of Workers' World Party. Comrade Sam.
Comrades and friends, to those of us who had an opportunity to read this morning's paper or yesterday's, you probably might have noticed substantial articles in the New York Times and I assume in other newspapers, which reported on interviews by Secretary of Defense Weinberger and that also of Secretary of State Schultz. Both of them were interviewed also in the media. According to the news accounts of the interview, I have no doubt that they are fairly accurate. Weinberger is said to be opposed to the use of military force to solve the Libyan problem. That's what he said, both in television interviews and quoted in the New York Times. Schultz, Weinberger, as you know, has always been a hawk, super hawk, and really an extreme hardliner. Schultz, on the other hand, has been cast as a moderate. And Schultz, in this interview, both in the media and in the capitalist and in the print, urged military action. Now, as we all know, and I have written considerably about it, that the Pentagon and its chiefs are usually in the front ranks of military aggression, and that the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex is the real infrastructure of the contemporary ruling class, and certainly its monopolistic section. And today, Libya has disappeared from the front pages of the papers and also from the media, at least during the early part of it. What are we to make of it? What are we to make when we see our vicious, extreme exponent of militarism state that he is opposed to military action against Libya, and says that it might gratify some people to bomb targets in Libya here is referring to, but they don't take in consideration the details and the consequences. the collateral damage, as he puts it, collateral damage. You will want to know what that may mean, the destruction of human life in the civilian population. That's collateral, you know. So we ask, I guess, that those who follow the papers and the media, naturally, they must indeed have some questions about this. How does that happen? That this reversal in roles between the Secretary of State, who usually mouths liberal phrases, suddenly becomes the hardliner. And those who are hardliners become moderates, easygoing, non-military solutions. Well, I think it would be important, as Marxists, always to view everything in the light of historical development, and never to take any single event and detach it from the entire course of historical evolution. Because if we do, we may be led astray. It is very important to analyze each and every social phenomena from a concrete point of view. And it is important to isolate each and every development in order to get the detail of it. But it is erroneous to divorce it from the historical pattern of evolution before. That certainly is the teaching of revolutionary Marxism. And so we want to go back a little, not too far back to ancient times, but let us say to the year 1967, which is called the Six-Day War in the Middle East. Six-Day War, which opened up on June the 5th. And at that time, during the Vietnam War, some of us who are maybe perhaps too young to remember, the Vietnam War occupied the center of attention. It was a big war that the U.S. was engaged in. And while the Arab people, and at that time under the leadership of Nasser in Egypt and others, and it seemed that there was preparation for another attack and to gird himself against Israeli aggression, having experienced one in 1956 and also in 1948-49. So it would be good to go back a little to the early days of that war and see how it was portrayed in the early days before the war. Before that war broke out, there was a consistent trend in the capitalist press, and which was widely embraced by sections of the bourgeoisie, and had the following features insofar as any developments in the Middle East were concerned. It was said that the U.S. was engaged in the wrong war at the wrong time and the wrong place in Vietnam. That was the wrong time, the wrong place in Southeast Asia. And that the area of most vital concern, the Middle East with its vast oil, was left at the mercy of the Soviet Union. And that it was wrong to be bogged down in that war. They were not opposed to Vietnam on principle. They weren't opposed to military aggression against Vietnam, but because it was just the wrong time and the wrong place at that particular time, when things seemed to be perhaps going on in the Middle East, where they might be deprived of such a vast empire. See? So it's very necessary for us, in order to get some perspective on why Weinberger becomes a soft liner and Schultz becomes a hard liner, reversing roles, to sort of roll back the film a little and see what happened at that time as a clue to what perhaps may be on now. It turns out that on June the 3rd, 2 days before the war started, President Lyndon Johnson proclaimed at a news conference, and supported by a statement on the Department of State, that the U.S., in view of its commitments elsewhere, would have to be neutral in any conflict in the Middle East, and thereby proclaimed neutrality. See? Then, on June the 4th, the newspaper which had been most vociferous in attacking Johnson for failure to pay attention in the Middle East, suddenly did a turnabout and said, well, our government is engaged elsewhere. We have to be neutral. Well, when you see the Johnson administration and you see the chief organ of the capitalist press, citing the civil liberals and pro-Zionist section proclaiming neutrality, following the government which has proclaimed itself neutral, well, you might say, well, it might be there's a lot of noise going on in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Arab people, but maybe that's all there is. A lot of posturing, a lot of talking and so on. But since the U.S. has proclaimed neutrality, and since the capitalist press is following the government, well, perhaps that's what it is. But within 24 hours, not even that much, the Israeli military swooped down all over the Middle East, destroyed in one swoop hundreds and hundreds of planes in Egypt and Syria, Lebanon, every place, and took most of the territory that it still holds today in one giant preemptive attack. What a trap that was for anybody who believes the capitalist government and the capitalist press. That should be inscribed in the memory of all who are in the anti-war movement, of all who are in the struggle against imperialism, and all also who have faith in the democratic institutions of the so-called free enterprise system. You see? That Six-Day War, it was a preemptive attack, carefully prepared long in advance, in which the Israelis were seen as the underdog, so to speak, while the Arab people were mobilizing, as they said, hordes of them, encircling poor little Israel. But they had built up a tremendous military machine, with the most sophisticated planes and radar and so on. And even after the attack, after the war seemingly came to an end, the U.S. didn't cease to proclaim itself somewhat neutral. Although all its aircraft, everything was all prearranged and pre-organized, it was a sham and a fraud. And we've got to remember that. We've got to remember it. Of course, the Egyptian government in 1973 also organized a surprise attack in October of 1973. But it has not dislodged the Israelis. It has not dislodged imperialism. And it would be very hazardous for us to think that since the U.S. is so heavily preoccupied everywhere else, that it could not logically launch another preemptive attack. I hope, certainly among us, there isn't anybody who believes that hostages or the killing of children or terrorism or any of that all has anything to count one iota, or that human values are involved, that the U.S. needs a pretext and just can't find one so they won't attack. All this talk about going around to the Allies and saying, oh, the poor Allies, they are not supporting us. They are very bad. They think about themselves only, see? And they don't want to support us with sanctions. All we're asking them is that they have some economic action taken against them, and very few of them are doing that. And the poor U.S., it has to stand all alone in this war. And only because they want to hold up the torch of liberty, see? Hold it high. See, that's what. Oil? That doesn't really concern them so much. It's only billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. But as Schultz and Weinberg and and Reagan, they say that they're not concerned with the material thing, but the spiritual values of this system that makes it run. See? We ought to see what's happening. We're not saying there are no difference between Schultz and Weinberger. Of course there are differences. But there can also, and are, they're cooperative on a class basis, something that we have to educate our working class to be. Of course there are differences among them. Differences on when to strike and where to strike and under what circumstances. How else can it be? But that's their differences on how to dominate and to control. Not to bring genuine freedom and democracy. Sure, they have their differences. They always mask them in the most elegant language to hide the most sordid motives. Now, of course, there are differences in them. That's the contradiction of imperialism. Often leads them into a blind alley. But they're united in their common objective. And that's what's important as far as we're concerned. So let's see now what is their basic problem. Their basic problem. Well, in striking any place, they got to consider all around the globe as to what they can and cannot do under circumstances. How do we know whether they have not got plans for Nicaragua, which momentarily may conflict with the timing in the Middle East? Well, we have some timing conflicts ourselves. We have this great demonstration going for Philadelphia, and there are 2 or 3 other events which must be given significance, and some perhaps even more so, depending on the situation. So they may have. That's Central America. They got to think about that. February the 7th, there'll be an election in the Philippines. Where there's a great revolutionary army struggling to overcome bourgeois parliamentarism. The People's Army of the Philippines. They've got to think how this will affect the situation with Marcos. They've got to think also how it will affect the situation in Southern Africa. They do have to think as to whether their imperialist allies will not support them, not because they have any real sympathy for the Libyan people and for the Arab people as a whole, but because there is a continuing struggle between the imperialist allies and the U.S. over the resources of the world, including the very valuable resources in the Middle East. Of course, objectively, the imperialist allies do not want the U.S. to come in and take all of the Middle East including Libya, and leave the imperialist allies out. They would rather have an increased chunk of the resources. Poor West Germany, it doesn't have any oil of its own. Yes, poor imperialist West Germany doesn't have any oil of its own in its own soil. Is it not entitled to a fair share from the suffering of the oppressed people in the Middle East? Isn't the Netherlands entitled to a greater portion of it? And the British, and the French, and the Italian, all imperialists? Isn't that what they fought 2 world wars about? I mean, we can forget all about that and just focus in on Gaddafi and how he is a personal dictator and all that, and that's the big question, that's the big issue. And leave out the world context. Leave out the interrelationships between the banks and the military, between oil and super profits, and so on. So, the U.S. has a problem, U.S. imperialism, in staging and timing an event. And it is restrained and encouraged at the same time by a variety of contradictory factors. Deception is always congenital with them. It is a feature from which they can never disentangle themselves from. You know, like morality in New York City politics, you see. So there is a borough president who tried to commit suicide or whatever. We shouldn't convict him before giving him a trial. He's entitled to presumption of innocence. See, it has to be like that. So, to consider the situation in the Middle East in relation to Pentagon strategy, we first of all have to consider the broad class interests as the predominant factor. And that any statements, any pronouncements, any press interviews, and in the capital media as a whole has to be viewed in the light of the interests of the ruling class, which are as predatory as it has ever been in all the existence of the so-called free enterprise system. No confidence must be given to it at all. We must view it as objectively as we possibly can and to try to disentangle truth from fiction, especially when we deal with issues of war and peace. We should not look upon U.S. maneuvers in the Middle East, oh, it's just a threatening game. They don't mean to do anything. It's just like Harding Carter, the former advisor to President Carter, and this press spokesman says, oh, it's all talk and no action from the Reagan administration. Notice the cunning of the liberal bourgeoisie in that respect. and of the capitalist media and the press in particular. They pride themselves on having a free press, see, and that they are always confrontational with their own government. They have an adversarial relationship with the government, not a cozy one. They're not controlled by the government. But look over carefully, run the reel back on the media, the electronic media on the Middle East, or on any one of the questions. They are confrontational. They are. In what way, though? In what way are they adversarial? You have a good example if you watched it. You had the patience and the time to watch it on Nightline the other day when the moderator, Ted Koppel, was interviewing Weinberger. He was being confrontational. Seemingly baiting him to come on, and why don't you do something in the Middle East? It's all words from you and no action. That's being confrontational. Going to becoming more right-wing than the most right-wing Secretary of Defense in years. And so you have the liberals doing the very same thing. CBS, supposedly having been a liberal, and fear of being taken over by Ted Turner, the great reactionary from the South. That is from South Wall Street, you know. Right near the docks over there, where you see the city court towering way above, you know. Because it doesn't amount to anything. It's the banks that are bankrolling them. But the media has been confrontational with the government, not in a progressive way, not in a democratic way calculated to expose them, but to egg them on. See? And that's what they are doing with respect to the Middle East, and why it is so difficult to get a mass opposition in the struggle against imperialism, particularly in that area of the world where it is so difficult to get support, and it's been difficult over the years. I mean support in this country, of course. Now, among the considerations that Pentagon has to take account, they of course has to take into account even more than all the other factors, is that if they launch a preemptive attack, they're likely to rouse up millions not only in the Middle East but elsewhere. You know, the first thing they have to do if they're going to do it, you know, you can't keep everything a secret. You've got to notify all the U.S. embassies across the globe. Because once the preemptive attack is launched, there'll be mass demonstrations all over. You better lock the doors and the windows or get out of the embassy. Don't they have to do that too? You got to send out the telexes and code numbers in some way? It's not that easy. But that's what some of the great minds are working on. That's what's involved is possible, and they have to take into account the revolutionary consequences flowing from such an attack. Might they do it anyway? Yes, they might. It all depends upon what they call their geopolitical situation, and whether they are significantly prepared enough to do it. And we have to assume at all times that they are prepared. And you must remember that the military never feels it is fully prepared. They never seem to agree that they had enough of guns, tanks, munitions, of all. I don't know, ever remember any of the militarists saying, oh, we've got too much money now from the pension. We got too much money. Well, let's cut it all down. You know, it is an endless affair with them. Now, we must also know as to why it is the specific target. Libya is the specific target. In a general way, it's the whole Middle East that's a target. And for that matter, so South Africa. We should not forget that to a certain extent the war in the Far East is still going on. And the U.S. has not resigned to the loss of any of its privileges out there either. But at the moment, it would seem that the greatest danger lies in the middle, in U.S. provocations in the Middle East. I think we should all know that the sporadic violence that has occurred at the airports and other areas, what is it? It's part of the struggle to liberate the country. The Middle East from imperialist influence. The war that started way back in 1949 with the U.S. and British support for the establishment of the Israeli state. It's still going on. The disestablishment of a whole people and turning them into refugees over a period of decades. It cannot but become a people's war for liberation, even after having suffered setbacks and victory, and setbacks again, and more victory, setback. And it's all because imperialism continues to hold on with all its might and main, no matter how many people are opposed to it in the area, to the vast riches. At the moment, if I were watching the situation very carefully and trying to read between the lines in one way, but watching for other objective signs as to what's going on, I might notice one thing, but I wouldn't put a great deal of faith in it. I would notice that the price of gold has reached an all-time high for 14 months. In these 14 months, it has steadily gone up. And why is that? Because whenever there is a so-called war crisis that's drummed up by the U.S., money begins to flow out of dollars into gold or other currencies. And so gold, which has been at such a low, particularly in relation to South Africa, has gone up because of the fear of war. Now, I wouldn't consider it an infallible sign by any means, but it's a significance, and that's one of the signs. Even Syria, although Syria is much more of a formidable factor in the struggle in the Middle East, and why it has raised so much heat, and it isn't because of the loss of human life. It has two. One is that Libya was totally controlled economically from about early 1950s until 1969. And it's the second largest producer of certain types of oil. And it was all under the control of the U.S., all of it. And so, when in 1969 a revolution started with a coup d'etat. First, the U.S. tried a military coup to overthrow the young regime of Gaddafi. They tried one coup in 1970, and it failed. And then they tried another coup, I believe in 1971, and that failed. After which the U.S. was asked to move out. And they lost their military base, as Comrade Joyce just mentioned to you, the military base in Libya. Well, losing the military base, bad as it is, isn't the end of everything. But they also nationalized and at least took over under government control most of the industries. Oil. And that is basically a very serious development. With Saudi Arabia, and even with Iraq, and of course with Oman, and with the United Emirates, there's been nationalizations all over there. It's hard to know often what they mean and how the oil companies have a variety of arrangements with them. But they have least amount of control in Libya, even under the so-called good times of the early 70s, which of course were not at all normal diplomatic relations based on coexistence, that is, let alone. So that there's a very sharp difference between the way the Gaddafi regime, rather than government, is conducting itself and some of the other Arab and petroleum governments. Very much it is conducting itself the way the early Egyptian regime under Nasser. And it's important that we give a little time to the internal situation there. Remembering, as the leaflet we gave out on this meeting is that Libya is under the gun of the Pentagon. But it's necessary for us to know what the internal class situation is. From what the bourgeoisie said was a military coup d'etat, it has turned into a profound social revolution. But it is in transition. And for purposes of the revolutionary struggle against imperialism and now unconditional defense of all the oppressed people and all the socialist countries, it is necessary that we view it from the point of view as to what our tactics ought to be, what our strategy ought to be in the struggle against imperialism and for the defense of oppressed people, regardless as to whether they are under a feudal monarchy, a bourgeois parliamentary regime, a Marxist regime, or a regime that calls itself socialist, but may not necessarily be so yet. We are duty-bound, and we've demonstrated that we are for its unconditional defense against imperialism. And that's what we want to have done and tried to do, and must do more in each and every case in the struggle against imperialism. But it's also important in certain areas not to have any illusions and not to be carried away so that we make mistakes, and by making mistakes, we cause others also to make mistakes. Now, the government calls itself socialist, and I can't use the Arabic term for it because it don't sound right from the way I would pronounce it. But the government ruled by the masses, as the term Arabic would be. And it proclaimed itself as socialist. And much of it, like Carmen described earlier, are very progressive measures that are taken by the government, some of which may not be as liberal and progressive as in some other countries, even in socialist countries. So that it's important. Now, where there are reservations that we must have, not with respect to defending the country against imperialism, but to know what its internal dynamics are and what's happening, is on the definition or the evaluation of what kind of a class regime it is at the present time, so that there won't be a mistake, not by us, but by others, as happened in Iran, where Khomeini seemed so popular and seemed to be moving in a revolutionary direction and was proclaiming himself to be for democracy and for equal rights and so on. But then, as you know what happened, he destroyed the young revolutionary Marxist movement, destroyed the Tudeh Party, and in effect instituted a theocratic, dictatorial regime, which is anything but democratic from the viewpoint of the masses. It nevertheless still maintained an anti-imperialist image. No. I should mention this on the rant, that while our press had a consistently correct position, we always took into account the fact that our people and those of our readers understood that there were a lot more reservations with respect to Khamenei then we might have spelled it out. And in retrospect, we might have, considering that we're talking to a broad audience. But it's not always possible to do these things because of the pressure of imperialism is so great that you don't want to have the slightest amount of criticism. But nevertheless, you have to alert the revolutionary vanguard in this country and anybody else with whom we're talking to, so that there won't be any errors. To be on the alert. Because a lot what Khamenei had done in Iran is what Chiang Kai-shek did in China, and cost so many lives and took 27 years to bring about the revolution after that. Well, I don't want to say this about Gaddafi. We certainly don't hope for that. We're looking for a revolutionary perspective, and we believe that the achievements made in Libya are of tremendous and profound significance. Well, this is what has to be said, see. When he took over, he was a very young man, which is just right for a revolutionary to be bold and courageous and do what has to be done. But he was opposed to Marxism, and is today opposed to Marxism, and he characterizes in his little book, the Green Book, he puts an equal sign between capitalism and Marxism, and says bourgeois democracy is the equivalent, same thing as reactionary every place, and he makes no distinction for socialist countries. All parties are no good, and so on. That's a very difficult reservation to have. And when he took over, I imagine, and what he had in mind was to have the kind of socialism that Nasser of Egypt tried, to sort of blend some of the progressive features of a socialist system together with the Islamic religious tenets, to have a sort of a eclectic form of government, but mainly retaining bourgeois ideology and, in Egypt, bourgeois institutions. See. So that his fundamental writings, see, like what's in the Green Book and in his talk to the Madrid University as he did by satellite, he has his own idea and his own vision as to what the world ought to be like. And in many respects, it is beautiful and wonderful as he describes it. And he says, well, that it's against Marxism and capitalism and imperialism, and will liquidate the police force and also do away with the military and do a whole lot of that. And some of it is borrowed without acknowledgement from Marx and from Lenin, and sort of all put all together with Islam, together with religion and so on. But that would be okay 200 years ago, and it was very good for Thomas Müntzer in the 15th century in the struggle against feudalism. He was a communist, Thomas Müntzer. He was the left wing of Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther of the 16th century, the left wing one of the Communist Society, and he preached it in religious language and so on. And it was, for that century, it was progressive. But to do the same thing, and especially to borrow from Marxism, and at the same time attack it. At the same time say all parties are no good, of the working class and so on. Except, of course, the party that really is in control of it. It has a danger. It has its progressive features, but it is not what, for instance, the Angolan revolution. You know, in Laos, there was a monarchy at one time. It's not too far long ago. And you know, it was the prince who led the revolution. The prince from the monarchy, Suryanabhang of Laos. Oh, we don't think of princes leading socialist revolutions. But if we close our eyes completely and just see one phenomenon and leave out the whole world context, then we are not really examining the situation in its correct historical context. So to get back to the Libyan regime, because it has so many fundamentally progressive and socialist-oriented characteristics, and because it has taken the oil, which the imperialists believe is their divine right, they want to overthrow. So I think the imperialist press is probably correct when they say that in 1985 there were 2 attempts at a coup d'etat, and that one of them may have resulted in the killing of a Hassan Ishgal, who is considered a very important leader in the original revolutionary command, and that the Libyan government has not acknowledged it. We don't know whether any of this is true, but that there are attempts to overthrow the regime that we believe to be true. So what is the class character of the regime? I'm taking the time out to go into this because I suspect there'll be questions about it. So in an effort to make short of it, I'd say this. I'd like to draw your attention to a very significant article in the New York Times. It was January the 14th, 1986, in which it points up what I think is the character of the regime. Is a regime which is characterized by dual power. What do we mean by that? Well, they probably tell you in that article without so much as spelling it out, and that is this. In the struggle against imperialism and against the native bourgeois and feudal elements, the government of Muammar Gaddafi felt obliged to form revolutionary guards, a revolutionary militia composed of the general population, and also governing councils, popular organs of the government, mass organizations. Now, these two characteristics are very much characteristics of a new socialist regime, genuinely socialist. These two characteristics are more. Popular militia, based upon the masses, and arming them, if they in fact are already armed, which may be the case. And organs among the civilians, committees, like committees for the defense of the revolution in Cuba, like Soviets in revolutionary Russia, like the Paris Commune, the prototype of. See? Now those are very two fundamental features. Where is the other leg of which constitutes that society at the present time? It is the old professional corps of the army, which is bourgeois. And as the capitalist press says, they may be very hostile to Gaddafi and hostile to the social reforms, to the progressive features of a new society, and they may be pro-imperial. Elements of them may be. So that it is a regime of dual power in constant struggle with each other, and that it gives it an unstable character. And that Gaddafi, as an individual, at the present time is revolutionary and in struggle. See. Much of what he says cannot be accepted by Marxists, but on the other hand, we must not fall into the trap of confusing our working class, revolutionary socialist criticism with bourgeois propaganda, which is destructive and slanderous and aimed to undermine regime and to overthrow it. Now, the other point to remember, as an analogy, who overthrew Nkrumah in Ghana? CIA. Who's working inside Libya to overthrow Gaddafi? CIA. When they say the professional military corps, that's the people they brought up. See? You can't easily get rid of them. You have to carry the revolution forward. Sometimes you may integrate them, but that's a question. What happened with Nkrumah? He took over, and he had socialist convictions from the very beginning, and lead towards Marxism from the very beginning. I think even when he was in Harlem, working in a fish store or something like that. See? But by the time he got back, the British who controlled it built up a military. See? That's the lasting legacy of British imperialism all over. See? That's the legacy they leave. They build up a bureaucracy. They support the landlord regime. Even that could be overthrown. But with the military, you feel obliged to keep it, especially if you come back from exile. You come back and the military is there. Now in his last years, Nkrumah tried to get rid of the military. See? So he tried to do what Gaddafi is doing. But the Nkrumah was a conscious Marxist. Nevertheless, to get rid of the military that you came to as an exile, see, and that military is theirs, see. And they pledge loyalty and support to you. See. Towards the end of his life over there, he began to see that the military was maneuvering against him. And so he tried to build up a workers' defense guard, a militia, to counterpose the military. And when the dual elements of became obvious to the British and to the U.S., they got there first and they overthrew it. See? And substantially, this is what the process is going on in Libya today. You don't know. And we don't know which way Gaddafi will ultimately lean. We only hope for the best. It could retain itself the way it is for a long time. The imperialists may pull their horns in. But on the other hand, when you look at the Mediterranean, with all its warships, well, all this armor over there, those are not pigeons nesting in idle smokestacks. That's not the case. We must not view it that way. We have to view it as a threat, and as an imminent one. And while we have our sociological evaluation of the internal character of the regime, what we need to do is to fortify our defense of it. Break down the imperialist propaganda of lies and slander. Break it down. Nowhere else have the U.S. succeeded in carrying out such vicious and monstrous attacks as they do on the Arab people generally. And only because it's such a fabulously rich area. That's the only reason. If it had remained a desert, without oil, without resources, scarcely any attention would be paid. It would have only geopolitical significance. But oil has transformed it, which could be such a great help for the rest of the world in many ways. Imperialism breaks everything down. Now, there are probably a host of questions. But I must say, I look forward to discussing this with you at a time when we got so many important struggles in this country right over here. Right here with its vast unemployment, with its racism, with our close proximity to Central America and to Puerto Rico and to South Africa and all that, we have to keep an eye on there. And in case of emergency, notwithstanding everything else that we are doing, and that we do our revolutionary anti-imperialist duty with everything that we have, all in the interest of the development of socialist humanity.
What significance does Sam attach to a statement by Gaddafi made the other day that the U.S. assaults and threats against Libya would force that country to become a socialist one?
I think he really put it that way. The full text of his thoughts are not available in the capitalist press, and there's much distortion in what he says. But I assume that what he said was that if the U.S. attacked, it would be forced to get more assistance from the USSR, and that would mean more collaboration with the USSR and some of the socialist countries. But it does not necessarily mean a change in social institutions or a change in political ideology. But
that Spain recognized Israel, which was in the paper today, have any relationship to the fact that Spain does not have oil?
Oh, I think it is merely the effect of all the pressure from U.S. imperialism and the imperialist allies, and that the socialist, so-called socialist government is joining the ranks of it with its imperialist partners in that respect.
Comment on the present situation in southern Yemen, and does it have a relationship to what's going on right now in Libya or anywhere else in the region? Comments and friends should know I'm repeating the questions for the sake of getting them on the tape, and also so that everyone else can hear them.
Well, first of all, I would say I know very little about the situation in South Yemen, except that they overthrew the old monarchy. They got rid of the imperialism. They had no diplomatic relations with the U.S., and that it has been characterized as a socialist regime in the sense that it is allied with the other socialist countries. But it is in an area where it lends itself to social instability. It's a very poor country, least industrialized, not like Libya, not like Syria, not like Lebanon, not even like North Yemen, and it has surrounded by Saudi Arabia, and it is a difficult situation. The capitalist press says that there's a struggle between two Marxist factions, one more pro-Soviet than the other. I find that somewhat difficult to assess. And I would say it is one situation where we do better by holding our own counsel for a while until there's clarity, because we simply do not know enough. Second, I do not know enough to have an informed opinion on the matter.
Would Sam comment on the fact that the U.S. has frozen Libyan assets in the U.S. and Gaddafi is threatening to freeze U.S. assets in Libya? And the questioner wants to know, what is the extent of U.S. assets in Libya?
The real extent of U.S. assets in Libya is really not known. But most of the important construction projects there are being done by U.S. subsidiaries under other names. And U.S. banks have been underwriting a lot of the loans. Now, some of the companies that are construction and engineering corporations, like Bechtel, of which Schultz and Weinberger were directors of that firm many years ago, and they still have links. See? And then there's Root and Brown. And only recently, this vast irrigation project that the government undertook is also being constructed with funds that were made available by U.S. banks. Now, the bourgeoisie has a contradiction, see. They want to overthrow the regime, and one way to do it is to strangle it economically by putting on sanctions and that the U.S. should lead in it. On the other hand, they don't want to get out so that the others could get in and find themselves in a situation where they're not ready to militarily attack. Now, the freezing of assets does not amount to much. And the freezing of assets either way by the U.S. or Libya is not a significant factor when you measure it against its military significance. Now, what is more significant is that the U.S. has urged all of its citizens to get out of there, has cut diplomatic ties virtually, and is conducting a campaign among the allies to get some agreement, undercover agreement, to overthrow the regime, and notwithstanding its economic situation. The economic situation had deteriorated in Libya as a result of capitalist overproduction of oil. There's an excess of oil. There's a glut. And that's an incentive to the imperialist bourgeoisie to intervene in the Middle East, and that would raise oil prices. It would be a boon to them and a convenient diversion from problems in the U.S.
Sam could please comment on the incident in the Persian Gulf where Iranians stopped a U.S. ship looking for contraband weapons. And at first, the U.S. government called it an outrageous act and said they would respond, and then they reversed and said that Iran was justified on entering the ship.
I don't think it had much significance at all. I think it was bold about the Iranian Navy to embark upon a U.S. ship, because many of the ships are carrying cargo to Iraq. And the government, see, they're deathly scared of the U.S. launching this attack. They're afraid of it because they fear that there'll be the masses will sweep them away. That is the problem. Now, the so-called moderate regimes, that is, those who are in complete collusion with U.S. imperialism, they have been forced in the last 2 weeks to denounce the U.S. They did it at the Islamic conference, and all the ambassadors in Washington went to the State Department and urged them not to attack. In fact, they all protested vigorously, according to accounts that I've read, so that it is the masses are a deterrent. They know what can happen, and they even fear what will